Assalamu alaikum students. Today our lesson is about comprehension. Today we would be reading a poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronaut, and we would be working on some comprehension question answers. You would be needing New Oxford English Book 8. We would be working on textbook page number 2 and 3. We will be completing question number 1 and 2 of exercise A. Today our lesson is going to take approximately 70 minutes. So get all your notebooks and pencils and your textbooks, pencils, sharpeners, erasers ready. So let's get to work. By the end of today's lesson, we should be able to identify the main theme or the message of the poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronaut, recognize the use of rhetorical device or figurative device, that is anaphora, in the poem, and we will be answering some given questions of comprehension at the end. So guys, before I start reading the poem, let's discuss something. What do you think is astronomy? Come on, give me your best guesses. There is no harm in being wrong. Yes, astronomy is a natural science that studies objects and phenomena or stories of the space. It has mathematics, it has physics, it has chemistry, it has all the different branches of science in it. In this, the scientists study planets, moons, stars, galaxies, and comets. Do you think it is all about magic, or do you think it's real? Yes, it's a science. It's very much real. Scientists study the planets and the objects in space to understand them. There are charts and maps and so many things involved in it. Fascinating. Now, before we study the poem, let's talk about the poet a little bit. Now, the poet who wrote this poem was Walt Whitman. He was born in 1819 and he died in 1892. He was a very influential American poet. Influential, do you know what influential means? Influential means that he was very well respected in the literary society. Whatever he said was considered to be of importance. Also, he was a journalist. He was a teacher. He was a government clerk as well. His most famous and major work was considered to be a volume of poems that was Leaves of Grass. He kept on adding more poetry in this book. He was famous for being a very unconventional poet. Do you know what unconventional means? Unconventional means that he was not like all the other poets. Whenever he wrote a poem, it had no rhyme scheme. And such a poem is called that this poem is written in free verse, meaning it didn't have any rhyme scheme. Walt Whitman was very famous for writing such poetry. He was considered to be the master of it. Now guys, before we start reading the poem, let's talk about something fun. Now in this game, there is no winner and there is no loser. What I want you to do is guess from the title of the poem what the poem might be about. You can be right, you can be wrong, and afterwards we will see whether you were correct about your guess or not. So think about it, tell your teacher all your guesses. Now before we start reading the poem, let's look at a few difficult words so that when you read the poem you don't get in trouble. Now let's see. Mystical. What do you think is the meaning of the word mystical, learned, and lecture? Take a guess. Tell your teacher the guesses for all three meanings. Yes, mystical means spiritual or something very fascinating. Learned means somebody who is very well educated. Lecture is when somebody is presenting something or talking about something or teaching a subject. Now, before we start reading the poem, remember that while you're listening or reading the poem, I want you to look for certain answers. There are 4 questions I want you to find the answers of or think of the answers of. Who do you think is an astronomer after reading the poem? Did your opinion about the astronomer change after reading the poem? Remember, in the beginning I told you to make a guess who or what an astronomer is. Then, third question is, what are the poet's thoughts and feelings in the first and the second half of the poem? Did his feelings and thoughts change in the second half? And also find out what is the main message of the poem. Best of luck, guys. I hope you enjoy the poem. When I heard the learned astronomer. First of all, I will read the poem and then the teacher will give you the opportunity to read the poem as well. So listen carefully. When I heard the learned astronomer. When the proofs, the figures were arranged in columns before me. When I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, to divide, and measure them. When I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room. How soon unaccountable I became tired and sick. Till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself. In the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in the perfect silence at the stars. Now guys, after reading the poem, I know you will be able to answer the questions I asked you earlier. Who do you think is an astronomer after reading the poem? Yes, he is a person or a scientist who studies the objects that are in the space. For example, the planets, the stars, and the comets, and the meteors, etc. Now, you have to tell your teacher now, did your opinion about the astronomer change after reading the poem? What are the poet's thoughts and feelings in the first half, and what are his thoughts and feelings in the second half of the poem? Of course, we saw that the first half of the poem was a bit lengthier as compared to the second half of the poem. It appears that the poet is getting tired and moving outside the room where the lecture is going on. So what do you think is the main message of the poem? Did you think about it? Yes, the poet is telling us that the science cannot show us the mystical wonder of nature. We must experience it for ourselves. Also, you might have your own different opinion, so you have to tell that opinion to your teacher with the logical reasoning and answers. Now let's try to answer some more questions from the poem. Now look at these 7 questions and try to think of their answers. Now the teacher will pause the video over here while you think about the answers of these questions. In the first half of the poem, where is the poet? In the first half of the poem, yes, the poet is in the lecture room. Well done. Who is he with and what is he doing? Of course, he's with an audience and listening to a learned astronomer talk. Which words or phrases show that the astronomer is respected by the poet and the audience? Yes, the words learned and with much applause, these are the words that these word and this phrase shows us that the astronomer is very well respected by the poet and the audience there as well. What scientific tools and methods does the astronomer use? The astronomer uses proofs and figures and diagrams to show that how he studies all this, and this is a science and not some make-believe magic. He uses addition, he uses division to measure all the distances and properties. In the second half of the poem, where is the poet? Well, very good. In the second half of the poem, the poet is outside. Who is he with and what is he doing? Yes, he's on his own and he's looking at the night sky. What words and images in the first half of the poem are a contrast to the perfect silence in the final line? Meaning, what is the opposite of what we heard earlier? Yes, we heard in the first half of the poem the perfect silence in the second half of the poem, and there was a sound of applause in the first half of the poem, and then in the second half of the poem he was talking about the perfect silence, and that is the difference between the first half and the second half. That is the total opposite, where there was a lot of applause, and in the second one there was a perfect silence. Good job, guys. You have done a great job. Now, guys, now that we have read the whole poem and we have discussed the question answers as well, now let's talk about the rhyme scheme or the syllables of the poem. Yes, is there a rhyme scheme in the poem? Come on, think about it and tell me. No, there is no rhyme scheme in the poem. What are syllables, by the way? Syllables are beats. There could be 2 syllables in a word or 3 syllables in a word, meaning there could be that many beats in the word, or in a line, or in a sentence. So now what I want you to tell me is to calculate how many syllables are there in each line of the poem. Now check carefully, I'll wait for your answer. Yes, the first line has 10, second has 14, third has 18, fourth has 23, fifth line has 14, sixth line has 14, seventh line has 13, and the last line has 10 syllables. See, the number of syllables increase till the fourth line, and then till the last line they become less again. Now, what does the difference in syllables in the last 4 lines tell you about the feelings of the poet? Yes, it shows us that the poet is getting calmer and more in control, and also it tells us that the poet is sort of getting tired and sick and weary. That is why he is speaking less and less. So there are less syllables in the last 4 lines. Well done, guys. Let's move on. Now let's talk about what sort of poetic devices we have read earlier on in our courses. Alliteration. Yes, alliteration is repetition of consonant sounds. For example, seashells. She sells by the seashore. Here the sound of S or sh is being repeated. Simile and metaphor. These two are used in the time of comparison. Simile is used to compare with the help of like and as, and metaphor is used for direct comparison. Assonance. Yes, assonance is repetition of vowel sounds, like fleet, fleet, sweep by sleeping streets. However, today in our lesson we came across a new poetic device or a rhetorical device. We call it anaphora. In case of anaphora, there is a repetition of certain word or phrase or sound. This repetition is used in the beginning of successive clauses. It is used in poetry and in speeches, and it emphasizes a particular idea or creates a certain impact. Now guys, let's study the example of anaphora in the poem we studied today, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. Now see in this poem, when, and again when. It is there in the beginning of all the 4 clauses of the first 4 sentences. That is why it is the repetition of the word or phrase of the sound in the beginning of the successive clauses. 1, 2, 3, 4, and in the beginning of all these 4 lines you see the word when. Also, it is emphasizing an idea or creating certain type of an impact that tells us that in the first half of the poem, the poet is admiring the astronomer and how the lecture room is filled with applause and everything. So it is emphasizing a certain idea. Now, what I want you to do is that how is the repetition of sounds in the second half of the poem is used to show that the poet is captivated by the stars in the night sky. Now take your time and think about it and tell me. Yes guys, in the second half of the poem, we see the repetition of the sound of t. When he talks about tired, when he talks about till, when he says time to time, perfect, and here we see the repetition of the t sound. This is how he captivates the audience. And also, see very carefully the sound of silence at the stars. This also shows us the repetition of the s sound, which creates a very soothing atmosphere, as if it was very calm and quiet. Remember, we use the sound of shh when we want something to be quiet? That's what it is. Now guys, after talking about all the poetic devices and anaphora, and after discussing all the questions that were there at the end of the book, let's do some written work. Come to your Oxford English books and open page number 3. You will see that there is an exercise A. In question number 1, part A to H, most of the question, rather all the questions we have discussed in the class. And in question number 2, part number C and D, also we have discussed in the class. Now, what I want you to do is that do the exercise and answer these questions in your notebooks. Take 20 minutes or 25 minutes and complete this task. Now guys, once your classwork is complete, submit it to your teacher according to her instructions. And your homework is use the following in sentences of your own. Proofs, learned, lectured, gliding out, and silence. We have studied meaning of all these words in the book today. Also, I want you to answer question number 2, part number A and B in your notebooks. This is on page number 3. We have done part number C and D already in the class. Now A and B you need to do from home. And this task is not at all difficult because we have already discussed the answers in the class. Now remember guys, none of your sentences are going to be copied from anywhere. Try to make sentences on your own. Best of luck guys. Now guys, before we sign off, let's wrap up the lesson by summing up what we discussed today. What is the main message of the poem? And what is anaphora? Come on, tell your teacher. Well done guys, you have done a great job today. Have a great day.